Eleanor Chase built a 12-showroom empire on one rule: no problem sits long enough to win. Then her $3.9 million Bugatti Chiron Supersport died on a Thursday morning in Denver. No warning, no error code, no explanation that survived the night. Hunter Blake arrived with 5 specialists, $500,000 in contracts, and 8 days of diagnostic equipment that couldn't find a single thing wrong. The car was perfect. It just wouldn't run. On day 9, a faded blue pickup rolled through the service gate. Isaac Ward stepped out, worn jacket, calloused hands, a parts box under one arm. He walked past the Bugatti, stopped, and something in his posture went very still. Not confusion, recognition. He knelt beside the rear quarter panel. 3 minutes, one motion. The engine fired, and everything in that garage changed. The showroom on Cherry Creek Boulevard was not designed to make people comfortable. It was designed to make them want things. Italian marble ran the length of the floor in pale gray slabs, each seam aligned with surgical precision. The lighting had been calibrated by a consultant. Eleanor Chase flew in from Milan, not to illuminate the cars, but to sculpt them, to find every curve, and hold it still in the kind of amber warmth that made $3.9 million feel like the only reasonable number. There were 12 cars on the floor. Each one sat as though it had been placed there by hand, tilted 2 degrees, positioned so that wherever you stood, at least one car was looking back at you. The air carried a faint mineral coolness, the kind produced by climate systems, precise enough to maintain a single degree of variance year-round. Everything in the building was intentional. Nothing had been left to chance. Eleanor had opened this location 7 years ago, the 8th in what was then a 9-showroom operation. She built the others the same way she built everything, by deciding faster than the person across the table and trusting the thing in her chest that had never once been wrong about a deal. It was not bravado. It was pattern recognition so deeply ingrained it had stopped feeling like thought and started feeling like instinct, the way a musician stops thinking about fingering and starts thinking about music. By the time Chase Prestige Motors expanded to 12 locations across 4 states, the industry had stopped being surprised by her and started being careful around her instead. That was the version she preferred. She arrived at 6:45 every morning. Not because the showroom opened at 9, not because anything required her before 7, but because the building was different before the staff arrived quieter in a way that felt earned. She would walk the floor, once touch nothing, and know if something was wrong before she could name what it was. 17 years, and that walk had never failed her. The morning it mattered most, she skipped it entirely. On the Thursday in question, the temperature outside sat at 31 degrees Fahrenheit. She went straight to the private garage at the rear of the building, punched in her code, and stepped into the space where the Bugatti lived. It was a Chiron Supersport. She had taken delivery 7 months ago after a 14-month wait, and in those 7 months, it had started every single time she touched the door. She didn't drive it often. That wasn't why she owned it. She owned it for the same reason she owned the Milan lighting consultant and the marble floors, because precision taken to its absolute limit becomes something else. Something closer to a statement. She pressed her palm flat against the driver's door. Nothing. Not the soft resistance of a system waking, not the faint electronic hum that preceded the unlock sequence. The car sat completely inert under her hand, as indifferent as furniture. She tried the handle. Nothing. She pulled her phone, opened the Bugatti Connect application, tapped the remote start. The screen processed for 4 seconds and returned an error she had never seen before. She stood in the garage for a long moment, hand still on the door, and felt something she hadn't felt. In years, the specific cold discomfort of a problem she could not immediately solve. Not anxiety. Eleanor Chase did not do anxiety, but something more precise. The recognition that the tools she normally reached for were not going to be the right tools for this particular thing. She didn't know yet how right that recognition was. By 8 that morning, she had called her head of service operations, her dealer contact at the regional Bugatti office in Chicago, and a diagnostic specialist she had used once before on a Koenigsegg with an adaptive damper issue. By noon, all three had confirmed the same thing. Every system on the car read normal. Battery voltage normal. Engine management module no fault codes. CAN bus communicating correctly. The car was by every available measure completely fine. It just would not run. Hunter Blake arrived on day 2 with 4 technicians and a pair of cases that required 2 men each to carry. Auto Elite International operated out of a climate-controlled facility in Scottsdale, and their reputation was built on the kind of work that didn't get discussed publicly: a gearbox replacement on a private island in French Polynesia, a software recalibration performed on a moving yacht somewhere in the Aegean. Hunter had been flown to places most people only saw in photographs, to fix cars that most people would never sit inside. He was accustomed to being the most qualified person in any room he entered, and he wore that certainty the way some men wore good watches, not to show anyone just because it felt wrong without it. He shook Eleanor's hand at the garage entrance and told her they would have a preliminary diagnosis within 48 hours. His grip was firm, his eye contact direct, and his tone carried the specific calibration of a man who had delivered that same sentence in front of many difficult clients and understood exactly how much reassurance it was designed to produce. Eleanor nodded once and left him to it. The team was competent. Eleanor watched them work during the first 2 days with the detached attention of someone observing a process they respect but don't yet trust. They moved efficiently, spoke in a technical shorthand that had clearly been developed over many shared jobs, and kept their workstation organized in a way that suggested professional pride rather than obligation. Hunter ran the operation with a precision that would have impressed her in another context. He made no unnecessary movements, issued no unnecessary instructions, and demonstrated across those first 48 hours a quality of focus that explained why clients flew him to private islands and paid him accordingly. By day 4, the preliminary diagnosis had produced a 30-slide technical deck and no working answer. The Odyssey diagnostic platform had run full system interrogations twice. The CAN bus reader had pulled every logged data point from the car's onboard memory. A firmware update $47,000 applied on day 3 had changed nothing. A video consultation with Bugatti's technical support team in Molsheim, France, $38,000 had produced suggestions already tried. On day 5, Hunter replaced the primary ECU. The car still did not start. Eleanor reviewed each update in the same conference room at the same table with the same expression. She asked specific questions and received specific answers, and said very little that was not a question. The questions were always precise, not the questions of someone fishing, but of someone mapping the exact boundary of a known unknown. Her assistant had learned somewhere around day 3 not to ask how things were going. By day 7, there was a secondary tension in the garage that had nothing to do with the car. Logan Pierce, the youngest member of Hunter's team, had raised the possibility of an undocumented ground path in the rear electrical architecture during the afternoon briefing. His reasoning was careful. The fault's resistance to every conventional diagnostic approach suggested it might exist outside the documented system entirely in a configuration the standard schematic didn't account for. Hunter had listened for 90 seconds and dismissed it. The standard schematic showed full ground coverage. The diagnostic data confirmed it. Introducing undocumented variables at this stage would scatter the investigation rather than focus it. Logan had written a note in his own file and said nothing more about it. That note would matter later. By day 8, the whiteboard in the garage held a fault tree that branched across the entire surface in 4 colors. Hunter stood in front of it each morning, the way a general might stand before a campaign map, with the posture of command and the eyes of someone who had stopped being certain the map was accurate. On the morning of day 9, he called Eleanor into the conference room and presented the next phase of the investigation: full removal of the primary circuit board architecture, an additional 5 to 7 days, an additional $120,000. Eleanor sat across the table and let him finish. Hunter Blake was not a man who responded well to being interrupted, and she had learned in the first 48 hours that the most effective way to handle him was to give him the complete shape of his own argument before she responded to any of it. When he stopped talking, she looked at the proposal sheet on the table in front of her. Then she closed the folder, set her hands flat on the cover, and looked up. "I'll give you 24 hours. Hunter opened his mouth. "That's not a negotiation," Eleanor said, not unkindly. "The way you state a fact to someone who has been confusing facts with opinions." She stood, picked up her coffee, and walked out. The blue Ford F-150 pulled through the service gate at 11:47 that same morning. The paint had gone dull in the way that happened to working trucks, not from neglect, but from use. The hood slightly lighter than the cab, the passenger door slightly lighter than the hood. Each panel carrying its own small history of sun exposure and weather. On the dashboard, wedged between a phone mount and a digital multimeter, was a piece of notepaper. A child's name was written at the top, in larger letters, the kind of larger that wasn't deliberate, just the natural emphasis of a name written by a parent. Many times, the hand knowing the shape before the mind issues the instruction. Below it, in the uneven hand of someone who had written, while driving a pickup, time a reminder to buy groceries. Isaac Ward climbed out and lifted a parts box from the passenger seat. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, with the particular build of a man who had spent years in physical work, not for fitness, but because the work required it. Not large, but settled, like someone who had long since stopped wasting energy on anything unnecessary. The jacket he wore was canvas olive green, the cuffs worn pale at the fold. His hands, when they closed around the parts box, showed the specific callousing that came from tools used daily and correctly, not the soft hands of management, not the scarred hands of carelessness, but something between the two and more particular than either. The delivery was legitimate, a standing parts order for the service department's German vehicle bay, routed through a supplier whose main contact had changed numbers without updating the distribution list. Isaac had confirmed the address before leaving Lakewood that morning. The contact name on the form was outdated, but the address was right. He walked through the service entrance and followed the internal signs toward the parts, receiving desk at the rear of the building. The route took him through the edge of the main service bay. Through the gap between a partially lowered lift and a steel shelving unit, he could see the corner of the Bugatti. Just the rear quarter, the tail lamp housing the edge of the diffuser, the distinctive crease of the rear haunch. The car was covered with a protective cloth that had shifted slightly, exposing that one angle. Isaac's stride did not slow, but something in it changed a quality of attention that hadn't been there a moment before. The way a person's posture changes when they hear their name spoken in a crowd. He kept walking, reached the parts desk, set down the box, signed the receiving form. The technician slid toward him. Then he looked back toward the service bay. From the far end of the garage, Hunter Blake was watching him the way a man watches something that doesn't belong in his field of vision. He turned to the nearest technician without addressing Isaac directly. "Who authorized a vendor in the technical area?" The technician looked between the two men. Isaac offered no particular reaction. He picked up the parts receipt, folded it once, and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he looked at the Bugatti properly this time, through the wide gap between the shelving unit and the lift column. "How long has it been down?" he asked. The question was directed at no one, specifically the tone of a man thinking out loud rather than beginning a conversation. One of the younger technicians, not yet calibrated to Hunter's preferred protocol, answered. 8 days. every system clean, no fault codes. Won't start. Isaac looked at the car for another few seconds. What month was it delivered? Nobody knew offhand. Someone said they'd have to check the intake file. Isaac nodded the small inward nod of someone receiving confirmation of something they had already suspected. He turned back toward the service entrance parts, receipt in his pocket, and began walking toward the door. He had 3 more deliveries before 2 o'clock and a note on the dashboard that said he needed to be in Lakewood by 3:30. He was almost through the door when he stopped. He turned around. Not all the way, just enough to face the service bay. Again, weight shifted back onto his rear foot, the way a man turns when he's decided something before he's finished deciding it. He looked past Hunter, Blake, past the technicians, past the diagnostic cart with its cables coiled neatly on the lower shelf, and fixed his attention on the rear of the Bugatti. "Have you checked the secondary ground point behind the BMS module?" Hunter Blake turned from the technician he'd been speaking to. He looked at Isaac Ward, the way a man looks at a variable that has no business appearing in his equation. "The secondary ground point," Isaac said again. Same tone. Not a challenge. An observation stated aloud. Hunter set down the tablet he was holding. When he spoke, it was with the precision of a man who had been questioned before and had long since prepared his answer. He went through the work, 8 days of it, condensed into 30 seconds of crisp enumeration. Every diagnostic platform, every firmware revision, every replaced component. His team had done everything the documented architecture required, and the documented architecture was extensive. He delivered the final line with the finality of a closing argument. Ground integrity was verified on day 1. This is a Bugatti Chiron Supersport. It is not a car where a basic fault goes undetected for 8 days. Isaac let the full weight of that settle before he responded. "Which ground points?" Something moved across Hunter Blake's face quick enough that most people in the room would have missed it. A half-second delay before he answered, the kind that didn't come from uncertainty about facts, but from the slightly different cognitive process of reconstructing what you'd actually done versus what you'd assumed you'd done. The distinction between those two things was small in most situations. In this one, it was everything. He listed the primary chassis grounds, the main battery negative terminal, the 3 standard bonding points in the rear electrical bay. All of them verified against the standard diagnostic schematic. "There's a secondary ground point that doesn't appear on the standard schematic," Isaac said. "It's in an auxiliary enclosure, added for a specific production variant. If this is the car I think it is, that point exists, and none of your diagnostic systems would know to look for it." Hunter's chin lifted slightly. That's a significant claim from someone who came to deliver parts. Isaac looked at him directly. 11 years at Molsheim, lead calibration engineer for electrical architecture. My team handled the production specifications for the Chiron Supersport and the DVO variant builds." He stopped for a moment, not for effect, but because the next part mattered, and he wanted it stated cleanly. "I signed the production configuration documents for this car the week before I left." The garage did not get louder. It got quieter in the particular way of a room where everyone has just recalibrated their understanding of a situation. The technicians near the diagnostic cart didn't look at each other. They looked at the car. There was a quality to that collective stillness that felt less like surprise and more like the moment after a correct diagnosis, when everything you've been staring at rearranges itself into a shape that finally makes sense. At the workstation to the left of the main lift, Logan Pierce set down the printout he'd been holding. He was in his early 30s, the quietest member of Hunter's team, the kind of technician who processed information before speaking, and therefore often finished third in conversations, even when he'd arrived at the right answer first. On day 7, he had been one of those third-place finishes. He was looking at Isaac Ward now with the expression of a man watching a door open that he had been told was a wall. Hunter turned to Logan for a fraction of a second, just long enough to register that Logan was not surprised. That registered too, and the room understood what it meant, and nobody said anything about it. The silence lasted 4 seconds. long enough to be a different kind of silence than the one before it. Hunter Blake had been in rooms where the dynamic shifted. It was an occupational reality of his profession. But a shift of this particular geometry toward a man in a canvas jacket carrying a parts receipt was not one his internal architecture had been built to absorb smoothly. Hunter Blake recovered quickly. He was above everything else a professional, and professionals had contingencies. Auto Elite cannot accept liability exposure from an uncertified third party performing work on a vehicle currently under an active service contract. He kept his voice level, the tone of policy rather than argument. If any damage occurs as a result of unauthorized intervention, Eleanor Chase was standing in the doorway between the conference corridor and the garage. No one had heard her come in. She looked at Hunter for a long moment, not with anger and not with warmth, the look of a woman doing arithmetic. 8 days, she said. $500,000. She turned to Isaac. What do you need? Hunter did not leave the garage. He moved to the station nearest the primary diagnostic cart, crossed his arms, and watched. The posture was composed enough that he might have believed no one noticed what it meant. Isaac noticed. He said nothing about it, picked up his parts box, set it on the clear workbench along the near wall, and turned to the Bugatti. I'll need someone who knows the car, he said. Not to Hunter, and not to anyone specific. Logan Pierce was already moving. The auxiliary enclosure was not visible from any standard approach angle. It was set into the left rear section of the engine bay, behind a flush panel that matched the surrounding bodywork so precisely it read as solid surface, unless you knew what you were looking at. Isaac crouched at the rear of the car and ran 2 fingers along the panel edge, feeling for the release point. He found the first catch pressed. It felt nothing give. Tried the second position lower and further right. The panel released with a soft, definite click and swung outward on a single concealed hinge. Logan leaned in beside him. The wiring inside the enclosure looked entirely normal. The insulation was unmarked, no discoloration, no heat staining, no corrosion at the terminals, no visible break in any of the conductors. Whatever was wrong here would not announce itself. Isaac already knew that. From across the garage, Hunter Blake's posture changed in a way too small to name. Just a shift of weight, a slight repositioning of his arms. The adjustment of a man who had expected something and was revising his expectation in real time. He had anticipated Isaac understood that the panel would either not exist or would reveal something obvious, a burned wire, a corroded terminal, the kind of visible evidence that would reframe the last 8 days as a search problem rather than a knowledge problem. Neither of those things was going to happen. Isaac reached for the flashlight clipped to his jacket pocket. He directed the beam at the terminal end of the ground cable, where the ring connector seated against the mounting stud. He held the light there for 4 seconds without moving it. Then, he angled the beam slightly downward toward the exhaust bracket just below, and held it there for 2 more seconds. His eyes moved along the bracket's edge, tracking the geometry of the cable routing, the small, deliberate modification that changed the angle of the run by 11 degrees. Logan watched him do this without speaking, but he followed the line of Isaac's gaze down to the underside of the bracket, where a 4-digit production stamp had been pressed into the metal. Visible only from directly below, only if you were already looking. Isaac redirected the flashlight back to the ground terminal. He set the light against the inner panel wall, where it would hold its angle, opened his jacket, and unclipped the digital multimeter from the inside chest pocket where he kept it. He set the probes, took the reading. He looked at the number on the display for a long time, not because it required analysis, but because he wanted to be entirely sure before he said anything. Then he turned the meter face outward so the display was visible to the room. Logan saw the number first. He straightened slightly, looked at the wiring, looked at the number again. When he spoke, it was almost to himself. Temperature dependent. Isaac looked at him. Logan crouched beside the open panel, and when he spoke again, his voice had the quality of a man explaining something he had almost said a week ago. The failure, he said, was at the wire insertion point on the ring connector, a micro fold in the conductor, not a break in contact, but a geometric irregularity that increased resistance under compression. At normal indoor operating temperature, the resistance stayed within acceptable range, but at the temperatures Denver had been running that week, 28 to 33 degrees Fahrenheit in the early morning hours, the metal contracted just enough. That contraction pushed the resistance value over the threshold the Chiron's ignition circuit required to complete the startup sequence. Not by much. Enough. By midday, when the garage warms up, Logan continued. The metal expands back. The resistance drops below threshold. Every diagnostic your team ran came back clean because you ran them indoors at operating temperature. He looked at the meter display one more time. The fault only exists when the car is cold. The garage held that information for a moment. Hunter Blake said nothing. He was still standing at the diagnostic station with his arms crossed, and he continued to stand that way, and the expression on his face had moved past the stillness it had held before into something quieter and less defended. There were frameworks in his professional vocabulary for equipment failures, for documentation gaps, for client disappointments. There was nothing in it for this specific configuration of events, a man he had dismissed in under 30 seconds, who had walked through the service gate by accident on his way somewhere else, who had found in 4 minutes what 5 credentialed people with $500,000 in resources had not found in 8 days. The gap between those two outcomes was not a small gap. It was the kind of gap that a person either learns from or spends considerable energy not thinking about. Logan set his hand briefly on the edge of the open panel, not gripping it, just resting there. He did not look at Hunter. He looked at the wire. Eleanor had come back into the garage somewhere during Logan's explanation and stood near the rear of the space, close enough to hear, far enough to be watching the whole room rather than any single part of it. When Logan finished, she looked at the meter display, then at Isaac, then at the display again. She did not ask how this had been missed. She was already doing the arithmetic on that question, and she could finish it without anyone's help. She crossed to the key safe on the near wall, entered her code, and removed the Bugatti's key fob. She set it on the car's rear sill without ceremony within Isaac's reach. Isaac reached into his jacket and produced a short length of red wire coiled around 2 fingers, a small ring terminal, and a crimping tool from the parts box on the workbench. He set each item on the edge of the car's rear sill, in the order he would use them, the arrangement of a man who had done this enough times that the sequence had become physical rather than procedural. He looked at Eleanor. She nodded once. Isaac worked the way people work, when a task has long since moved past the stage of conscious instruction, not fast, not slow, but with the particular economy of someone whose hands knew the sequence before his mind had finished issuing it. He cut the damaged terminal end cleanly with the wire snips from his jacket pocket, leaving a fresh cross-section of copper. From the parts box, he took a square of fine grit sandpaper, folded it twice, and cleaned the mounting stud in 4 strokes, 2 across 2, with the grain of the metal. He measured the new wire against the run of the old one, added 3 centimeters for the service loop, and cut. The ring terminal went into the crimping tool, with the wire seated fully into the barrel. 1 compression clean and complete. He tested it by hand, a firm pull at the wire's base, then tested it again. Logan watched from 2 feet away without speaking. This was not the silence of someone waiting for instructions. It was the silence of someone who understood what they were watching, not just the repair itself, but the quality of competence behind it. The kind that didn't announce itself, didn't need witnesses, and would have looked exactly the same in an empty room. Isaac checked the resistance at the new terminal before making the final connection. The meter showed a value 17 times lower than it had read 4 minutes earlier. He looked at the number, once set the meter down on the sill edge, and connected the jumper wire from the secondary ground point to the nearest chassis anchor, a 4-centimeter bridge, dressed tight against the inner panel wall, so the enclosure would close cleanly over it. 40 seconds of work. He pressed the panel shut. The catch seated with a sound that was small and definite, the sound of something returning to the position it was designed to hold. He picked up the key fob from the sill. He did not announce what he was about to do. He did not ask for confirmation. He simply opened the driver's door naturally with the ease of a man who had sat in this specific car at this specific stage of production, who knew the weight of the door and the angle of the sill, and lowered himself into the seat. His left hand rested on his thigh. His right hand moved to the ignition button. He pressed it. The sound that came was not what most people meant when they said an engine roared. It had none of that suddenness, none of that brute percussion. What filled the garage was deeper than that, and more controlled the voice of a 16-cylinder engine with 4 turbines, waking in a space that had been built to contain exactly that amount of force and no more. It didn't arrive in the room so much as it established itself there, finding the corners, settling into the concrete and the steel and the Italian marble 20 meters away at the front of the building, resonating in the chest cavity rather than against the eardrum. It was the sound of a machine restored to what it had always been, the sound of a problem that was over. Isaac let it run for 15 seconds. Then he switched it off. He set the key fob on the roof of the car and stepped back out. Logan Pierce stood with his eyes closed. He had closed them in the first 2 seconds of the engine's sound, and when he opened them, he looked at the car for a long time without saying anything. There was nothing to say that the sound had not already said more precisely. From the diagnostic station, Hunter Blake watched the Bugatti sit in its returned silence. His arms had come uncrossed at some point. During those 15 seconds, he may not have noticed when. He stood with his hands at his sides now, and the expression on his face had moved past everything it had held before into something quieter and more exposed, not humiliation. He was too composed for that to surface cleanly, but the private acknowledgement of a man who had just encountered the precise location of a limit he hadn't known he had. He did not speak. There was nothing in his professional vocabulary designed for this exact shape of moment, and he was at minimum wise enough not to reach for something that didn't fit. Eleanor Chase was looking at the car. Just the car. After a moment, she turned and walked back toward the conference corridor without a word, and her assistant appearing at the doorway with a tablet fell into step beside her without being summoned. The meeting with Hunter Blake lasted 22 minutes. Eleanor sat at the head of the conference table. Hunter sat to her left with the composed, slightly forward posture of a man who had used the walk from the garage to construct something worth saying. He was not wrong, technically. He laid it out without defensiveness and without deflection, which she had to credit him for. Bugatti's third-party technical documentation did not include production configuration specifications for custom order variants. That was a structural limitation of the manufacturer's information sharing policy, not a gap in Auto Elite's diagnostic process. Working from incomplete documentation, his team had applied every available tool to the fault, correctly and exhaustively. The fact that the fault existed outside the documented architecture was not something any available diagnostic framework could have surfaced. These were all true statements. They were also, Eleanor thought, a very precise description of exactly what had happened, constructed in a way that carefully avoided addressing what it meant. She let him finish. Then she said, "On day 7, Logan Pierce raised the possibility of an undocumented ground path." Hunter's jaw moved slightly. The standard schematic showed full ground coverage. The diagnostic data confirmed it. "The suggestion introduced—" "I know what the suggestion introduced," Eleanor said. "I'm telling you what it was. He had nothing to add to that." She told him the contract would be paid in full, every line item, including the firmware update and the Molsheim consultation and the ECU replacement that had changed nothing. She told him there would be no extension. And she told him with the same tone she used for the rest of it that the referral arrangement they had discussed informally at the start of the engagement, 3 introductions to other collectors in her network, a conversation with a fleet operator in Scottsdale, would not be moving forward. Hunter nodded once. He gathered his papers, aligned them against the table edge, and put them in his case. He stood. At the door, he turned back, and for a moment it looked as though he was going to say something that hadn't been prepared in advance, something that came from the less defended place his expression had briefly occupied, while the engine was running. Then the moment passed, and the professional surface closed back over it. He left. Eleanor sat at the empty table for a while after he was gone, her coffee untouched in front of her, looking at the wall. She was thinking about Logan Pierce's note from day 7, and about the 90 seconds it had taken to dismiss it, and about the specific arithmetic of what those two facts added up to when you set them side by side and didn't look away. Logan found Isaac in the garage repacking his parts box. The other technicians had drifted toward their equipment cases with the particular purposefulness of people who needed somewhere to direct their energy. Isaac was working through his checklist, each tool back in its designated slot, the multimeter's leads coiled and laid flat before the lid closed. Logan leaned against the workbench. "Why didn't you say who you were when you came in?" Isaac didn't look up from the box. "If I'd introduced myself, the first question would have been why I'm running parts deliveries in Lakewood instead of working in Molsheim." He set the crimping tool in its foam cutout. "I didn't have an answer to that question I wanted to share with strangers." Logan thought about that. "But if you'd stayed quiet, the car would still be down." "That's why I didn't stay quiet." Logan looked at the Bugatti, then back at Isaac. "So, what's the answer? The one you didn't want to share." Isaac closed the lid of the box and tested the latch. He looked at Logan for a moment, not with reluctance, but with the deliberate quality of a man deciding whether a question had earned a real answer. He decided it had. "My son is 9, he said. "His mother died last year. Molsheim isn't Denver." Logan said nothing. There was nothing useful to add, and he understood that. He stayed where he was for a moment, not filling the space with words, but not leaving it either, which was its own form of acknowledgement. The kind that most people never learn to offer correctly. Isaac reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded delivery receipt from earlier that morning. He checked the line he'd added, while waiting on a separate call mid-morning in handwriting, slightly faster than the Rest Groceries pickup 3:30. He refolded it along the original crease and put it back. "I knew what was wrong about 30 seconds after I saw the exhaust bracket," he said. "The geometry is modified on that variant to route the secondary ground cable. You only see it on custom order builds." He looked at the car one more time. "It's a small thing to recognize if you're the one who put it there." Logan nodded slowly. "You read the production stamp on the bracket. I watched you do it. The last 4 digits put it in the serial range my team was signing off the week I left." Isaac picked up the parts box. "It was one of the last builds I worked on before I came back." Logan looked at him. "You knew it was your car?" "I knew it was from my production run. That's not the same thing." Isaac moved toward the service entrance, then stopped and turned back once briefly. "But it made it harder to walk out the door." Eleanor Chase came back to the garage when it was nearly empty. Logan was at the workstation filing the day's documentation. The Auto Elite cases were stacked near the service entrance, waiting to be loaded. Isaac was standing at the rear of the Bugatti, looking at the car with the unhurried attention of someone saying a particular kind of goodbye. Not grief, not sentiment, just the quiet completion of something that had mattered and was now finished. Eleanor stopped beside him. She looked at the car, too, for a moment before she spoke. "The OEM kit from Molsheim," she said. 3 to 5 days for delivery. Whoever installs it needs to know the exact termination point of the secondary ground and the correct torque spec for the connector block." She looked at him. "That's not in the documentation." "No," Isaac said. "It wouldn't be. I want you here when the kit arrives." Isaac considered this for a moment, not the logistics, which were simple, but the shape of what she was actually extending. A second conversation. A door left open by a woman who didn't leave doors open unless she intended them to be used. "I can do that," he said. Eleanor nodded. She turned toward the exit corridor, and she was 2 full steps past the threshold before she stopped. She did not turn all the way around. Just enough to speak back into the garage, her voice carrying the same register it held in boardrooms and contract negotiations, level with no performance in it. "8 days ago," she said, "if you had come through the front entrance instead of the service gate, I would have had you escorted out within 30 seconds. She let that sit for a moment, accurate and unvarnished. "I've built 17 years on reading people faster than they can introduce themselves. I want you to know that I know what that's worth and what it isn't." It was not an apology. Eleanor Chase did not traffic in apologies, which were performances of remorse, designed primarily to make the performer feel absolved. This was something rarer and more costly, a precise acknowledgement offered, without self-protection, from a woman who had spent 17 years with no occasion to make one. The kind of statement that costs more when it comes from someone who has never needed to make it before and knows it. Isaac looked at her back as she stood in the doorway. He said, "Okay." She walked out. He stood in the empty garage for a while after she left. Logan had gone to make copies at the service desk. The Bugatti sat under the amber lights panel closed, every system reading exactly as it should. Isaac looked at it one more time, not sentimentally, just looking the way you look at work that has been done correctly and is now finished. There was a cleanness to that. He had learned in the past year to pay attention to moments that felt clean. He picked up the red parts box, verified the latch, and carried it through the service entrance into the lot. The Ford sat where he'd left it, front wheels cut slightly outward from when he'd pulled in at an angle. He opened the rear door and set the box on the back seat, wedging it against the wheel well so it wouldn't slide. Then he got in the front, shut the door, and looked at the dashboard. The notepaper was still wedged against the phone mount, his son's name at the top, slightly larger than everything else. Below it, groceries pickup, 3:30. It was 12 minutes past 2. He had enough time. He started the engine, pulled out of the service lot, turned left away from Cherry Creek Boulevard, and took the back route he knew, the one that avoided the construction on the main arterial, and added 2 minutes, but removed the frustration of 3 lights in a row. 22 minutes to Lakewood at this hour, less if the interchange was clear. He thought about the car once more before Cherry Creek Boulevard disappeared in the mirror. Not about the repair was finished and didn't need thinking about. He thought about the bracket, the 4 digits on the underside pressed into the metal in a factory in Alsace on a morning he couldn't remember specifically, but could place within a 2-week window. The fact that the car had ended up here dead in a Denver garage, 8 months after he'd signed off on it, and 3 months after he'd driven back to a city he'd left 11 years before. There was nothing meaningful in that sequence. Coincidence was just pattern recognition applied to events that had no actual relationship. He knew this. He thought about it anyway for about 90 seconds, and then he didn't. The multimeter was on the passenger seat in its cloth case. Leads coiled the way he coiled them after every job, a habit so old it had stopped being deliberate. The window came down. The radio stayed off. Outside, Denver moved past in the particular light of a late morning in early winter, the mountains visible to the west, above the roofline pale and very clear. Behind him on Cherry Creek Boulevard, in a private garage with calibrated lighting and Italian marble floors, a Bugatti Chiron Supersport sat fully ready, waiting for nothing now except the person who owned it.